The logic that I have given 300 similar speeches, therefore I will do a good job tomorrow, does not make me feel better. Maybe a tad, but not much. But what does make me feel better is what I honestly feel about it, which is a bunch of irrational bullshit, but it is my irrational bullshit, and therefore is so important for me to be able to articulate that when I do that, it regulates me. I start to even out and calm down.
And I think there's a misconception that leaning into that makes it more true and makes it stick. I think a lot of people this seems to be a stereotype of men, but spend a lot of time being afraid of addressing something because they're worried that by getting closer to it, it will occupy more of them. But oftentimes, getting closer to it allows you to just experience it and go, this wasn't so bad, I'm Cody.
And I'm Evan.
Welcome back to Men's Search for Meaning,
the podcast where we explore concepts that we can all relate to and walk away with a deeper understanding of ourselves and what we think.
All right, so the idea that I had for this came when I was walking in the kitchen, and it was maybe the middle of the day, and I looked at the sink and thought, wow, how are there so many dishes again already? Just did the dishes recently. And a familiar feeling, perhaps a trigger warning should be added to this. And then I looked at it a bit longer and I was like, actually, there's not that much in here, but because it's so spread out, it looks like more than it is. And immediately that struck me as, that's very interesting that something can seem two different ways. I mean, in a sense, it doesn't sound profound, but when you stop and see a situation like that, I think it's interesting because to me, it illustrates the opportunity where I was in the specific context of the situation, noticing, if I, organize things a bit better, not that one wants to put a lot of time into organizing dirty dishes or something like that, but just noticing the opportunity that there was sort of a spectrum there, that the more spread out or, if there's food on stuff or something like that, it tends to look worse than if it's a neat pile or things are stacked from large to small or something like that. So, as is generally the case with the things that we talk about, this really has nothing to do with dishes for me. That is just the context that I observed a particular principle or concept in, and it's that concept that I find interesting, which is things can often look a certain way, but we have the power to change the way that we are looking at that situation as well. I could have organized the sink a little bit differently in under a minute and thought, this looks better now. Another example would be how many people shove their things into their dresser drawers and many people fold them. And I learned at one point, I was a shover earlier in my life. And then I learned, you can fit way more stuff in here when you just organize it differently. So anyways, this concept is appealing to me because it shows that the way we perceive a situation might not always be correct. And in being aware of this, we have the potential to change where we align on this spectrum of how something comes across to us. So anything come up for you upon hearing that, or any direction that your brain goes in?
For some reason, what it brings to mind is when you have a day that you're anxious about or is going to be really packed or has, something in it that is going to be difficult for you, how you're never able to accurately predict the outcome. Like basically that it's going to be okay. Usually you don't give yourself things that make you anxious that deserve every bit of anxiety that you're dedicating to them. For instance, like I give public speeches a lot for my work, and I've given hundreds by now. And yet I'm always a little anxious before each one, which I think is reasonable. But sometimes I don't even sleep as well before. And if I were to correctly organize these ideas in my mind, the ideas of what's going to happen in my schedule the next day, I think I would be able to come to, you're going to have a day. You've done almost the exact same things that you're doing in tomorrow's day in previous days. And based on history, it will be successful and you'll move forward. I am just not able to do that. My perception is always limited by the possibilities of what could be. And then by the time the day is over, I'm like, yeah, that was just, man, I could have predicted that. That was easy. Why is it that I can't do that? So I know it's a bit of a different direction, but it has to do with our perception being inaccurate. And I just can't find a way to organize those ideas properly.
I love this example. I absolutely love this example because I can relate so strongly, and I think
Mhm.
it may seem like a departure, but I think this is spot on to the observation I had, which is how are we perceiving what we think are facts of a situation to our own dismay? And this is exactly that. That was my experience with the dishes. Is like, oh man, these are the dishes. These are objects. These exist, and look how many of them there are. But organization plays a big role in that, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's a fantastic example that I can relate very strongly with, and it really is the crux of stage fright. Not saying that what you're describing is stage fright, but this concept is that, which is worrying about what might happen, and then generally going through with the experience and being like, "Oh, that was fine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That didn't have any of the bad things that I thought might happen." And it's a curious thing. I think as a human being, it's hard to have enough space from this to really describe what's happening because I can relate to experiencing that and it not making any sense.
Yeah.
Before the pandemic, I was in a number of bands and we would perform and I would feel nervous every single time. And it's like, I've done this before. I've practiced a lot. I was probably one of the people that would practice more or wanted to practice more than other people, partially because I wanted things to go well. Actually, entirely because I wanted things to go well. I wanted to try to do as much as I could to not feed into the anxiety that we can feel when it's finally time to do something. But yeah, it's such an interesting thing. And this
Hmm.
is a good opportunity for people watching to let us know if you relate to this, if you found ways around this that work for you, because I think nearly everyone, maybe 0.1% of people have cracked this to actually feel differently. There's something about just the way that we operate and the way that we think about things that make this prevalent. Some people, it is debilitating. And I think um, that is one end of the spectrum where people just don't go outside or they don't do things at all because of how much they're worried about what could happen, or they, kind of live their life in this extended panic state. And then there's people who can just kind of go into it and feel okay. And that is something that I aspire to more. As back to you and your specific experience, has this improved at all as time has gone on? You mentioned, "Oh, I've done this before. There's familiarity there." Have you found ways to leverage your experience or to rearrange the dishes, so to speak, to make this not look as bad as it once did? Or have you found any footholds with that? Because I think that's a really interesting topic of what can we do in situations like this, not
Mm-hmm.
specifically this, but situations like this to go, you know, I don't need to think about this right now, or
Mm-hmm.
let's see what happens, or something. Have you found anything like that?
Yeah. So I have, but first I want to differentiate between the idea that the speeches have gotten easier since I started, or I'm less fearful about them. That certainly happened in a very natural and understandable way. The first time I gave a speech, there was the fear that I would screw up, forget what I wanted to say, make an embarrassment of myself. And that was a reasonable fear because I had never done it. And the
Mm-hmm.
second time I gave it, it was a little less reasonable to worry about that. And I worried about it, 90% as much. But then 200 speeches later, and I'm probably, I don't know, 300 speeches total, in my life.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's basically a baseline level of anxiety. Like I don't know, maybe I call it 10% chance in my mind that I'm going to severely embarrass myself or fail. And that hasn't really changed. So I want to just make that distinction that it's way different from when I started. And logically speaking, I know it's going to go well each time. I'm not saying I give totally different speeches. I give the same general speech each time on the same marketing topic.
Yeah.
Um, but what I have learned, the only thing that helps me, and by the way, I forget to do this most times, is if I talk is if I talk through my anxiety with somebody who's really listening to me.
Mm,
Um, the night before, if I can find a way to properly acknowledge that I am scared of failing, of embarrassing myself,
hmm
um, even though it's illogical, if I can just say it out loud and someone can listen to me and hear it, then there's a processing of that anxiety that takes place. And then I will sleep better.
uh-huh.
And I will be able to just treat it as part of my day more so. It doesn't get down to zero. It's like an asymptote or whatever. It's just may
Yeah.
approach the better my planning is, but it will never reach zero anxiety.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's what's worked for me is actually processing it.
Yeah.
The
I like
feeling.
that you brought that up. And I have a question that I want to caveat, but I'll ask the question first, which
Mm-hmm.
is in speaking it out loud, you mentioned to someone that's listening. So not just saying it in front of the mirror or speaking to a cardboard cutout, but speaking to a live human being that is paying attention and listening. Do you feel like it's important that you get anything from them, any, reassurance or something like that? Or do you find that it is more just in the act of talking it out with an engaged person? Because, and the caveat I wanted to add is that I myself have found the power of saying things out loud and kind of processing things that way, because often when we think about things, I don't really, I don't think that we process thoughts in words to the same degree that we do when speaking out loud. I think it's kind of a combination because I observe myself at times wondering, am I thinking in words or in thoughts, if that makes sense? Because we've created language, didn't always exist. We created language as a way to translate thoughts to somebody else. So there's always going to be some room for error or some inaccuracies and whatnot, which is a whole separate topic. But saying things out loud, getting them out of your head and getting them to a point where you're hearing them back, either from someone repeating back what they're hearing to you or from just hearing yourself speaking. I process information differently that way. And
Mm,
oftentimes can find myself going, yeah, that doesn't really make sense. But
right.
when it's a thought, it can be this pervasive, looping kind of thought that can happen. So yeah, I'm curious if you find that it's more so hearing yourself saying it out loud, or is it more about getting a certain kind of feedback from someone that you're close to that helps you adjust your expectations or your perception of what may happen?
I think that me being able to say it is the largest part of it. And that is something I could do by myself, theoretically, through meditation or talking to myself, I guess, or writing in a journal. So that part I could do myself and it would really benefit me. But what the other person is doing is seeing me. They're perceiving what I'm saying and reflecting it back to me. And
Mm-hmm.
that is another big chunk of it. It might be like 60% is just me articulating, and then 30% is someone else reflecting that to me. So it's a full, kind of mirroring
Mm-hmm.
moment. But then I still think there's 10% that is reassurance. And a lot of
Mm.
people like to say, when you're nervous about something, you just want to be heard. You don't really need to be reassured.
Yeah,
It's true in many ways, but I actually like a small reassurance from someone that knows me, so I believe it.
sure.
If it's a genuine statement, like you're going to go out and do it as you always do, but I totally get that you're nervous, and I hear that you're saying X, Y, Z. That would be the perfect combo that would
Yeah.
allow me to process and feel better.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder if another prompt for people watching, if that is a recipe that people can relate with, that kind of breakdown of percentages. Um, because I just find myself wondering how universal this is, or if other people are just, I want to think it out on my own. I don't want to involve someone else in it because that makes me nervous. I have to think that the whole spectrum would be possible just based on other people's life experiences. So let us know in the comments where you align with this. If you found yourself in a situation like this, what has helped you, and on this specific topic, if you agree that it's mostly about processing what you're feeling out loud, having someone kind of mirroring that back in some way, someone that you trust or feel comfortable with, but also it being nice to receive reassurance. Um, because again, I have to imagine there's some people where the reassurance is all that they need, based on their own personal needs that they've developed from their life experience. I think I align most personally with just the processing, where it's like I just need to figure out what I think about it, and that uh, it's not that I would have a problem with hearing that from someone else or someone being like, "Oh, you're going to do great." I just trust it more, or it has more of an impact if I arrive at it myself, which is just kind of a funny thing.
Well, that's a real truism. I mean, that's the whole idea in therapy that, you get insights, but when you arrive at them, this is why therapists, certain types of therapists don't talk much, because
Yeah,
they're trying to guide you towards finding your own insight, and it solidifies much stronger that way. So
yeah, yeah. Those kinds of things, thinking them out loud is very helpful for me.
you know what this is making me want to emphasize. You were talking about, you brought up a really interesting kind of subtopic here, which is you think, let's say, in watercolor blotches, concepts, whatever you would call it, and you write or speak in words, you articulate in words. And this is why I think articulation is so important, because the lining up of the truth of how you feel with your expression in words is a way to feel better. The more closely lined up it is, the better
Hmm.
you will feel. This is why truth is such an important concept. Because if you can state what you believe to be true in regards to a feeling, you will feel better about that. You will be able to properly process it. If you mislabel the feeling and don't understand it, you will not feel better when trying to process it.
Yeah, I think this underlines this entire channel for us because this is the basis of our interest in communication and therefore interest in exploring subjects is the power of accurate communication and
Mm.
really being able, not so much being having an expansive vocabulary, but having enough of a vocabulary that you can communicate accurately for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then the trick being that you can do that as perfectly as possible and have no control over how that's perceived by somebody else. But I don't want to go too far on this tangent with that. But yeah, it I would totally agree that I mean this could come back to the analogy of the dishes again, which is like the more clearly you can read the situation and make adjustments, the more comfortable you will be. And that is true for communication as well. The more clearly you can understand what you think and how you feel about something, the better you can explain it to somebody else. So the better that they can understand you, the better you can understand yourself. Because I think there is some power to auditory processing as opposed to just thinking about something. Yeah, there's definitely something there. And I do think there's some degree of tangent to this, very interesting one, but to some degree, it seems to align with what we've been talking about consistently about accuracy, perceiving something accurately, whether it's yourself or an external situation. And maybe to get to that point, there's a little bit of back and forth that needs to happen of like, you know, whether it be me looking at the dishes going, wow, what a mess, and then going, actually, this is not as much of a mess as it looks like, and making an adjustment, or whether it be something that you're wanting to say or a way you're wanting to describe something about yourself, and then realizing, no, that's not quite right. It's more like this, and I think it's just helpful to model and acknowledge that there is a refinement process, no matter how good of a communicator you are or um, how much you excel at that skill, there's a refinement process in order to arrive at what you think about something or a reframe of a situation. Maybe, like we've talked about therapy, maybe seeing that one's perception of something that's more important, maybe it be relationships, family relationships or romantic relationships or friend relationships, noticing, I have the tendency to do this kind of thing, can I do something else because that's causing problems for me? And that being a difficult thing to do, but ultimately where a reframe comes from, and truly what the whole point of therapy is, you go in and you're like, this is what I think and feel right now. It's not working for me in these ways. And then
Mhm.
you explore different things to do. So just
Yeah.
wanting to really come back to this idea of sometimes it's really hard and there's a lot of refinement. Sometimes it's easy and you can just reframe things if you look at it long enough and go, oh, wow, I was totally jumping to conclusions. It's actually this, but it can be hard
Mm.
and difficult, but so rewarding and so important.
Yeah, absolutely. What you're saying is helping me put together like almost like a philosophical statement. Maybe it's an observation, maybe it's a philosophical statement, which is that truth regulates us. And
Hmm.
what I mean by that is when you know how you feel. So I'm talking about a personal truth here, like
Hmm.
what you feel about something or what you genuinely believe about something, which is going to be
Hmm.
different for different people about the same concept or experience.
Totally.
When you know that, it it calms your stress. It makes you feel better.
Hmm.
Um, so I think this is the reason why if you have a big speech the next day, if you don't acknowledge that you're scared about irrational things, which is your personal truth,
Hmm.
then you will not feel better until the speech is over and you know
Hmm.
the danger is gone.
Kind of this idea of you can't, once something exists for you, you can't just push it away and repress
Yeah,
it. It exists. So you either deal with it or you don't deal with it, but it doesn't change its existence.
right. And there's a big difference between, saying the truth regulates us and that truth would be logic, because logic doesn't make you feel better. The logic that I have given 300 similar speeches, therefore I will do a good job tomorrow, does not make me feel better. Maybe a tad, but not much. But
Hmm.
what does make me feel better is what I honestly feel about it, which is a bunch of irrational bullshit, but it is my irrational bullshit and therefore is so important for me to be able to articulate that
Yeah.
when I do that, it regulates me. I start to even out and calm down.
And I think there's a misconception that leaning into that makes it more true and
Mm-hmm.
makes it stick. I think a lot of people spend, this seems to be a stereotype of men, but spend a lot of time being afraid of addressing something because they're worried that by getting closer to it, it will occupy more of them. But
Yeah.
oftentimes, getting closer to it allows you to just experience it and go, this wasn't so bad. The
Mm-hmm.
analogy I love to come back to is like the classic childhood, like a coat rack in the dark looking like a monster. And you
Mm-hmm.
could spend a long time being afraid of that and thinking that by not addressing it, you're protecting yourself from it, but you're perpetuating a state of reaction to something. Whereas if you can turn on the lights and assess the situation, you can go, this is in fact not a monster. It just appeared to be one, and now I can let go of this. So there's
Yeah.
a real element of human psychology there where we are doing the opposite of what we should do in many situations. And I wanted to address that because I think it's especially common in maybe it's not specific to men, but it seems to be a stereotype of men to want to avoid things and be like, nah, we don't talk about that. Let's keep it light because there's this fear that if you address this place, then that's where you live. That's what your life will be from now on. But it's really the opposite.
Yeah. It's so true. And I really love that analogy. That's a very evocative analogy. The coat rack that
Hmm.
looks like a monster, that would look like a monster to a little kid. I totally relate to that. I probably felt the same way about a coat rack, maybe in my room
And
or a jacket.
many of these beliefs we have might have formed at that irrational point in our lives where we had a hard time assessing things, and then we
Mm-hmm.
bring that with us later on, and it's not serving us anymore because it's very outdated information. But I think it's exceedingly common for people to have a lot of things like that they bring with them from much younger points in their lives where they're not able to, or where there's an opportunity to revise this information and go, do I need to be scared? If you kept
Yeah.
pushing away your anxiety the day before giving a speech, I think it would ultimately consume you much more than if you can go, okay, let me sit with this for a minute, let me really explore what's going on, let me talk to somebody, and then okay, I feel better just from doing that. I feel
Yeah.
acknowledged. I feel now I don't need to hold this as much anymore. Even if that
Yes.
has to be repeated, there is a helpfulness to that, whereas trying to just repress it tends to make the pressure grow.
Oh, it does. It just things grow in the dark. Yeah.
Yeah. So sorry, I
And I,
didn't mean to interrupt you so much there, but you were talking about how much you liked the coat rack specific example. I just couldn't help but jump in with that piece.
oh no, I love that you did that. It added a lot. I want to make the same distinction I did before, but with the coat rack analogy, because I want to make sure that listeners totally see it from, at least from my perspective.
Sure.
And, maybe it's helpful, maybe you agree that with a kid, if you turn on the lights and they see the coat rack is just a coat rack, that does not immediately make them feel better. It helps a little bit. And it's a shame because kids cannot do this easily. They cannot access what is true very easily. Their minds aren't mature enough to do it, whereas adults can. If the child were to be able to say, I am really afraid of the dark. I believe there's all manner of scary things that can happen in the dark, and no one can prove that otherwise. I'm just scared. There's all these new ideas in my life and things that are beyond my comprehension that make me fearful, or whatever it is that's going on that make them genuinely terrified of the dark.
Mm-hmm.
That would help them to feel better far more than seeing the logic of the coat rack's just a coat rack. Which makes your point that you made a moment or two ago even more salient. That as adults, if we could go back and be like, oh, that's what's going on with that. That's what I was so scared of. It would be so valuable. You would be able to correct like everything from that point on. And I mean, that's almost the essence of what goes on when you're healing, from traumatic or bad experiences early on is you can go back to those feelings, but most people would avoid them forever rather than address them. But if you go back and acknowledge the feelings, not just what happened, that what happened is good because it leads to the feelings and they're always irrational pretty much. That's when you can actually, calm down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting perspective. I think that again, it's hard to say what the proportionality would be of different people with these perceptions, but I do feel like I am particularly susceptible to the logic of it. I don't know if that was always true, but when if I just kind of put myself loosely in this frame of mind of what we're discussing and how I might feel in certain situations, something that feels very comforting to me as an idea is the logic of, oh, it's not a monster. It just seemed that way. It's actually not. Some kind of pursuit of truth. Is this thing actually harmful to me? Is this thing not harmful to me? So that there's a certain effect that logic can have on me in many situations. And interesting counterpoint that I just thought of, you mentioned when you guys were doing some flying on a small plane in the last few years, that it was something that made you feel somewhat uneasy, which it does for me as well. It's like something about a smaller plane feels like it can crash much easier for some reason. It just seems more vulnerable. And that you did a lot of research on statistics to determine, maybe that was more so concerned with doing that activity with your son, which is someone you feel very naturally protective of and are in a protector role for this other person. But that one of the things that you did in that situation, it was probably a combination of wanting to be able to think out loud what your experience was, but that part of that was doing some research around what are the actual statistics around deaths or injuries from small planes, and on a more empirical scale, what is the safety? And I think what you determined is it's safer than riding in a car. Some of that might
Much
be
safer.
yeah. So yeah, it does seem like there, in certain situations, for you, the logic can be comforting as well, but maybe it's always in tandem with needing to process the feeling, whether irrational or not. Would you say that seems accurate?
I think because logic can make me feel fully better. It's only when I have irrational feelings, and those are more the basis of my fear than the actual thing. I think Because yeah, all the time I think like, oh, is there something dangerous here? If I find there's not, I'm not worried at all.
Sure.
But if it's something that has to do with like, am I going to be okay? Am I going to fail? Like
Sure.
stuff
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
that nature, which goes so deep into one's psychology and irrational fears that I think most people have. That's one where you have to go to the feelings, I think, because the logic that you're going to be okay doesn't do too much.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that's an important distinction. I'm glad I mentioned that because that
Yeah.
again makes a lot of sense, which is when the feeling is irrational and it's more of what I would associate with feelings that I'm trying to figure out how to say this in a way that isn't pejorative because that's not my intention whatsoever. But there's a lot of feelings we have that seem more associated with things we might have felt in childhood, of
Mm-hmm.
these
Mm-hmm.
kind of more, I think our more irrational fears are inherited from early parts of our lives and they stick with
Right.
us because we are who we were when we were younger, just older now.
Yeah.
We're
Yep.
not these, we're not this distinctly separate entity that began existing in adulthood. We are this, person stretched from childhood to adulthood.
Yeah.
But that when the fears are more irrational, yeah, logic can't reach them because that's not what it's about. And I
Mm-hmm.
think what it can often be about is needing to feel seen or heard or understood. It seems like a prompt for social connection of some point, maybe. That can just be comforting to us, just having people around to talk to, versus a fear of like, I don't want to go on a cruise ship because I am afraid of boats or something. And then you look at the data, which is like, because I don't know any better, I feel like this boat has a 50-50 chance of sinking. And then
Right.
you look at the statistics and you see that's not true, you know? So that distinction, I think, that does feel accurate to me from my perspective as well. What you described from your own perspective, that things that are less logical generally aren't as able to be reached with logic. And to come back to the coat rack example, I think different children could respond differently to that situation where I think there is an illogical basis, which is just, I'm scared of the dark, whether it's a coat rack, whether it's a closet, whether it's under the bed, something. There will always be something I am fearing about the dark because it generally feels threatening to me. But that's kind of this intangible, illogical thing. It's not
Mm.
about a specific concern. It's about generally feeling uneasy in a state where if the fear was like, I feel pretty good, but this coat rack is creeping me out. Then if you can see, it's just a coat rack, not a monster, then that might uh, ease that concern. Even in children, I think it's possible that it's much more common that the general uneasiness is what is persisting there or what is existing there, and that the children's fears might be consistently less logical. So maybe that is, they just need to feel generally protected and cared for and connected and looked after and whatnot. And then that's like, oh yeah, I feel better because I have put my trust in this other person. So yeah,
Yeah.
perhaps a long, long exploration into this, but I do think we came across a interesting distinction that I was not expecting to arrive at.
From dishes.
Yeah, I didn't know what you said at first. I was like, is this some sort of celebratory phrase? From dishes. Yeah.
We got here from you passing the dishes in the kitchen and being like, oh, how did there get to be so many of those?
And this is my favorite thing to do. I, I love that kind of observation where I'm like, wow, something looks a certain way to me. And then I pause for a moment and I look at it and I go, actually, I'm seeing the opportunity for a different point of view here. That is one of my favorite things ever. Um,
Yes.
and just to come back to a specific example from today, I mentioned earlier that I bought a photography drone. And the extremely exciting thing about that is like I get to see what things look like from up above as well, which is like a different physical perspective, but the same
Oh,
thing that is appealing to me. It's like I get to see how the things that I always look at look from a different angle. And that I think perfectly encapsulates what I love about what we're doing here and
mm,
these conversations generally before we even started recording them is how do we look at things that we often see from a different perspective, because that fleshes out or fills out your image of that thing. And for me, that is one of the most exciting things. Just knowing more about my world, whether it's my external world or my internal world, is just so fascinating to me. And I thought of a funny example. This is obviously a dramatic oversimplification, but to me,
Okay.
it hilariously illustrates why this principle is so important. If you go back to a physical space, which I feel like things in the physical realm are much easier to understand, you can see them, you can interact with them, you're just more consciously aware of them. Things where we're exploring aspects of our mind are a little less clear, a little more open to interpretation, maybe harder to see, like you're looking through fog or something. But if we take a physical example, a cat, okay? Picture a cat standing there facing you directly, all right? Not everyone is a cat person, but I think most people, or a kitten, let's pick a kitten. Most people would agree this is cute, right? I think
Mm-hmm.
there's some natural programming in us that this is a cute, small creature. And whether it's my favorite animal or my desired pet or not, you can associate with that. Okay. Now imagine you take that same cat and you spin yourself 180 degrees behind the cat, and now all you see is a cat's butthole. Okay. Very different experience,
Mm.
but it perfectly illustrates the importance of perspective. On one side of something, you can see something you might not want to see. And on the other side, you could have a very different response. The entity itself has not changed, but while it's a hilarious oversimplification, at least to me, I don't know if anyone else will find that funny. Um, it does demonstrate how shifting the focus you have on anything can drastically change how that thing looks to you. And I think that's something that feels exciting to land on at the end of this conversation is what can you do with this information? I think it's fun to explore topics, but I think it's important to try to determine what is the practicality of this information? How is this actionable? Can this actually improve? We touched on that a bit throughout, but um, my perspective, and then I want to hear yours, is just taking time to look at things. I think thinking critically is something that we come back to often. And you could take it a step further to say, don't jump to the first conclusion you think of, even if that ends up being correct. And maybe you still do that, but challenge yourself to expand on your perception there. Right. If you just see the cat's butthole and that's your first view of a cat, you might not like cats. But if you look at the other side of the cat, you might find your favorite pet there. So same thing is that we can have that same kind of experience in our own lives where for whatever reason we come across looking at something a certain way. Or you hear this with people, why are first impressions so important? Because it shapes an important idea of what we think of something. But it happens all the time where people have a bad first experience and for some reason they're forced to continue to interact, whether it be someone you know from school or work. And then you find out, oh, I actually kind of like this person. I just got a bad view of them the first time. And I think it's really important to be able to challenge our perceptions of things because we can often find a lot more there than we would have initially realized. And I think that is not only very important, but very impactful to our enjoyment in our own lives or
Mm-hmm.
just being exposed to that concept of like, wow, had I not come back to this idea, I would be in a very different position. Like I mentioned before, that I tried playing guitar when I was 16 or something like that, played for about a week and then stopped. And then I came back to it when I was 19. And for some reason, I was willing to approach it again. Totally different experience. And it felt like
Mm-hmm.
one of the most important things ever to me. So there's many people say, I've tried that already. Nah, I'm not into that or something. But and that could still be true, but there are many situations where we are at different points and we go, oh, actually, I'm kind of into this, but that openness is so important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree. I must be in a very big-minded intellectual mood, so I want to I want to summarize what you said and add one thing to it. I think
Sure.
to know a cat, you need to know what the cat looks. Okay, I'll try this. to know a cat, you need to know what the cat looks like head on, and you need to know what the cat's butthole looks like. Hopefully, not too carefully. But
Where this is a cat podcast now, we're giving pet advice.
you need to have all different perspectives on the cat to truly know the cat. Right. If you only
Yes.
know how cute the cat is, you don't know that they can be vicious or they can, be protective or whatever it is. There's many things to know, many different angles of a cat you'd want to see to truly know a cat.
Sure.
And, to bring it back to, that larger intellectual concept I talked about before, to really understand a cat. I'm sorry. Talking about knowing and understanding cats is getting me. So to really understand a cat, you would need to know, okay, so there's a cat here. What does the cat eat? What eats a cat? What are the right temperature conditions for a cat? How do cats interact with human beings? What will the cat add to my life overall? Like there's all these different next door puzzle pieces that would help you to fully understand the experience of, having a cat in your life. And that's another topic for another day. But to me, it's a really interesting adjacent that I like to ponder.
Yeah. Yeah. And that summarizes perfectly what I gravitate towards and what I think of as looking at things from different perspectives. It's like there's a lot of sides to all different kinds of things. It's intellectual topics or things that exist more in our minds are much more complex. Like if you think of an apple, it's like, yeah, you can look at a few different sides of an apple and you will understand more. Maybe one side looks fantastic and the other side is a big brown spot. And now you go, I'm not going to eat that side because that looks bad, So you got to look at things a little bit more. But I think thoughts are much more complex shapes and it's harder to look at those from all angles or living organism like a cat. There's a lot to that. What do they eat? What can't they eat? What do you do to watch out for them? What do you do to enrich their lives or whatever? There's a lot of angles to that. And, both of these are just analogous situations to the concept we're trying to describe, which is just how to have perspective on things. And I think it takes, what I hear you describing is it takes some exploring to see what you think about something. And you could say that's exactly what we've done today about the topic of perspective itself, is try to look at it from different angles and try to see what is there, how much of it is us, how much of it is the thing, and just to look at that overall. So yeah, I think that's come nicely full circle and is an interesting view of the perspectives of perspective itself.
Wow, we did that.
So hopefully that made sense to people. As always, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We really want to hear from you guys and guys and girls and everyone in between. People's thoughts on this. This is what fuels this whole thing for us. Perspectives. What's your perspective on what we talked about? If you enjoyed things, please hit the like button as well. It helps us get discovered by more people, and hopefully that can allow us to enrich the conversation even more, which is the main thing I would love to see happen. It's just a big conversation going with a larger community of people. Additionally, subscribe as well so that you see our uploads in the future, and hit the bell icon near the subscribe button if you want to be notified when we upload. So yeah, thanks everyone for your participation and checking this out, and we'll see you in the next video.